So this week we're going to be talking about sensory systems and then focusing in on the visual system. But I want to say a few things about sensory systems in general to start us off. And, you know, all these sensory systems are dependent really on detection of energy, on detection of stimuli. You know, and these stimuli are both, present externally, right? And they're impinging upon specialized receptors. But they're also present internally. So we get an awful lot of, sensory input, afferent input from, the conditions and the stimuli that are present in our own bodies. In order to detect, a stimulus, to detect some form of energy, you need some kind of specialized cell. So we're going to be talking about the visual system, and this is, somebody made a really terrific rod photoreceptor cell, which has these membranous discs at the back, which are, packed with a specialized pigment called rhodopsin. There's got to be some transduction is the fancy term for it. Conversion, basically. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, right? That's the first law of thermodynamics. But the second is that it can be converted from one form to another. So these specialized afferent cells, specialized neurons, sensory neurons, carry out that stimulus transduction. So electromagnetic radiation, for example, which we're going to see, is the sort of stimulus, the energy of light, right? It's within a very narrow range of a much broader electromagnetic spectrum, but we only have, specialized receptors that can detect, small components of the stimuli that are actually out here. There's a lot more here that we do not have any specialized equipment for, and we cannot detect, we cannot convert, we cannot transduce. But a photoreceptor will grab, a photon of light, within that range, or a wavelength, light with a wavelength within the visible light range, and it'll excite. We're going to see the rhodopsin. It'll be absorbed by that protein, which is generated by genes in your photoreceptor cells and their cell bodies, which should be down here, and then the absorption will cause that rhodopsin to move, and so it's been converted. The electromagnetic radiation has been converted into kinetic movement of that chemical, and then the rhodopsin will release. We're going to see a chemical that can go off and ultimately close a channel, and change the membrane polarization, which we'll see will have an impact on the release of neurotransmitter here, at the synaptic end. Physical energy, stimuli like electromagnetic radiation, or, for the auditory system, which we'll discuss, sound waves, there have to be some kind of specialized sensory, afferent cells, neurons that have evolved these, structural specializations that allow for the capture and transduction of whatever that energy or stimulus happens to be, and its conversion into neural activity, into some, pattern of action potentials, some frequency of action potentials, and distribution along specific networks. And so that stimulus transduction process, the capturing of the electromagnetic radiation and the conversion into kinetic, and then a change in neural activity, that's sensory detection, and it requires specialized sensory cells. However, in order to perceive something, it turns out that information's got to be distributed along specific networks in the brain. And those networks in the brain, we're going to learn, right? You've got sensory input, right, from the eyes, from these photoreceptors. It's going to go through a series of cells that are present in the retina, but there's going to be a cell that's going to send its axons out of the retina and form what's called the optic nerve, which is going to go to the thalamus. We're going to see a specific nucleus in the thalamus called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and from there the LGN is going to project into the most caudal aspect of the cortex here. Remember, along that calciferin fissure, in the medial aspect of the occipital lobes, we're gonna see the arrival into layer 4 of this visual input, and then distribution into networks in both the parietal lobe and also into the temporal lobe. And this is where, remember that cortex not only receives significant input from the thalamus, for visual input from the LGN into the occipital lobe. But remember, out of layers 5 and 6, the deepest layers, you've got projections back into the thalamus. So there's crosstalk, and there's lots of top-down influences, that will exert biases, route things in specific ways depending on context and expectation. And these specific networks are going to be absolutely essential, for sensory perception. So we're going to be talking a lot about the visual system this week and then the auditory system next week, but it's going to rely on specialized sensory receptors for sensory detection, for that conversion, that stimulus transduction, and then the distribution, with lots of top-down, feedback, sort of expectation and bias will drive it into specific networks that support, aspects of perception.